Chapter 5. Religion. Gods everywhere, all the time. A world saturated with the divine ancient Greeks didn't have religion the way we might describe someone going to church on Sundays. They lived inside religion the way a fish lives inside water. It was the medium through which everything else happened. The Greek gods were everywhere. Every city had its patron deity. Every home had a household shrine to Hestia and Hermes. Every journey began with a prayer and a libation. Every meal was preceded by a small offering to the gods. Every workshop, every ship, every army unit had its own protective deity. The line between religious practice and daily life was not just blurred, it essentially didn't exist. The Olympian gods, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, Hermes, Aphrodite, Ares, Hephaestus, Demeter, Dionysus, were understood as genuinely real, genuinely powerful, and genuinely interested and often meddlesome in human affairs. But they were not omniscient, omnipotent, or morally perfect. They argued, cheated, fell in love, took sides, played favorites, and occasionally made spectacular mistakes. Greek mythology is full of gods behaving very badly, Zeus's countless affairs, Hera's vindictive jealousy, Apollo's cruel punishments, Ares's battlefield rampages. These weren't moral failures that embarrassed the Greeks. They were features of a religion that didn't demand its gods be perfect, only powerful. This had a profound effect on the Greek relationship with the divine. You didn't worship the Greek gods because they were good. You worshiped them because they were dangerous and powerful, and you wanted them on your side. Religion was less about faith and more about reciprocity. You made offerings, performed rituals, and observed sacred obligations. In return, the gods, hopefully, provided protection, victory, good harvests, and safe journeys. It was almost contractual, and if things went wrong, it wasn't a crisis of faith. It meant either that the ritual had been performed incorrectly or that the gods had decided to use you to make a point. Festivals. The Greek social calendar. Religious festivals were the social events of the Greek year, and there were a lot of them. Athens alone celebrated over 120 official festivals annually, roughly one every 3 days. Some were small neighborhood affairs. Others were massive city-wide celebrations that shut down all normal business for days at a time. The Panathenaic Festival, held every 4 years in honor of Athena, was Athens at its most spectacular. The centerpiece was a great procession depicted in the frieze of the Parthenon, which you can still see fragments of in museums today, in which the whole city marched up to the Acropolis to present Athena with a newly woven garment. There were athletic competitions, musical contests, poetry recitations, and, of course, sacrifices on a massive scale. The meat from these sacrifices was distributed to the citizens, meaning that major festivals were also, effectively, the occasions on which ordinary people got to eat meat. The Dionysian festivals deserve special mention because they gave birth to one of Greece's greatest cultural achievements. Theater. The great Dionysia, held each spring in Athens, was a dramatic festival at which playwrights competed by presenting their tragedies and comedies before the entire city. The audience, which included women, slaves, and foreigners, alongside male citizens, sat on the hillside of the Theater of Dionysus and watched works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. When we talk about the invention of theater, this is the moment. The dramatic forms, the character archetypes, the storytelling structures invented in that hillside theater in Athens have shaped every play, film, and television drama written since. Chapter 6. Sparta, a different world entirely, the city that weaponized its own citizens. Everything about Sparta was designed to answer one question: how do you produce the perfect soldier? The answer they came up with was both brilliant and terrifying. You make the entire society into a military training program. Sparta was not a city in the normal Greek sense. It had no great marble temples, no famous philosophers, no theater culture, no magnificent pottery or sculpture. What Sparta had was the most formidable army in the Greek world, and a social system so completely oriented toward military efficiency that even Spartan enemies couldn't help but be impressed. At birth, every Spartan infant was brought before a committee of elders and inspected. Weak or deformed children were left exposed on a hillside, a practice the Greeks called exposure, and which was not unique to Sparta, but was carried out most systematically there. Healthy infants were returned to their mothers for the first 7 years of life. Then the state took over. At age 7, Spartan boys entered the agos, the state education and training system that would consume their lives for the next 2 decades. They lived in communal barracks, not with their families. They were fed deliberately insufficient rations, partly to toughen them, partly to encourage them to supplement their diet by stealing, which was considered a valuable tactical skill. If you were caught stealing, you were punished not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. They slept on reed mats. They cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River. They went barefoot in all weather. They were subjected to ritualized beatings as tests of endurance. At 12, the training intensified. Boys were assigned an older male mentor, a relationship that combined elements of what we might call coaching, mentorship, and in some cases, romance, in a way that was considered formative rather than inappropriate by Spartan standards. By 20, they became full warriors. By 30, they could finally live with their wives, though they were still expected to eat their main meals in the communal mess hall with their fellow soldiers. The infamous Spartan black broth, a thick soup of pork, blood, vinegar, and salt that reportedly tasted revolting to anyone who hadn't grown up on it, was the staple of this communal diet. The helots, Sparta's dark secret. None of this was possible without the helots, and the helots are Sparta's most uncomfortable truth. The helots were the enslaved population of Laconia and Messenia, conquered by the Spartans in earlier centuries and reduced to a state of permanent, hereditary agricultural servitude. They worked the land that fed the Spartan citizen class, freeing the Spartans from agricultural labor to devote themselves entirely to military training. The helots significantly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. Estimates suggest the ratio was somewhere between 7-1 and 10-1. This numerical imbalance was the defining anxiety of Spartan society and explains much about why the Spartan system was so extreme. A population that outnumbers you 10-1, that is kept in brutal subjugation, and that periodically rises in violent revolt, requires a very particular kind of response. The Spartans' response was permanent military readiness, constant internal surveillance, and an annual ritual called the Crypteia, in which young Spartan men were sent out at night to kill helots, particularly those who seemed strong, intelligent, or dangerous. It was institutional terror, and it worked. The helots remind us that ancient Greek civilization, brilliant, beautiful, intellectually stunning, as it was rested on foundations of slavery and violence that its greatest thinkers largely chose not to examine too closely. Aristotle argued that some people were slaves by nature. Plato's ideal city required a working class. The leisure that gave Athenian men time to philosophize, debate, and create theater was purchased at the price of someone else's freedom. This doesn't erase what the Greeks achieved, but it should be part of how we understand it. Chapter 7. The Symposium. Greeks knew how to party the dinner party. That changed Western culture. You've been invited to an Athenian symposium. Here's what to expect. The drinking will be strategic, the conversation will be intense, there will be poetry, music, philosophical debate, and quite possibly someone getting carried home. This is not your average dinner party. The symposium, from the Greek symposion, meaning drinking together, was the defining social institution of elite Greek male life. It was held in the andron, the men's room of the house, where guests reclined on clini arranged around the walls. It began with a meal, but food was almost secondary to what came after, the serious business of communal drinking, conversation, and performance. At the start of the drinking portion, the guests elected a symposiarch, a master of ceremonies whose job was to set the ratio of wine to water for the evening and determine the pace and structure of the drinking. This was an important role. Too weak a mixture, and the evening would be dull. Too strong, and it would collapse into chaos. The ideal symposium walked a careful line between loosening inhibitions enough to produce brilliant conversation and maintaining enough composure to actually have that conversation. Entertainment at a symposium could include professional musicians and dancers often hired for the occasion, but the expectation was that the guests themselves would perform. Educated Greek men were expected to be able to compose and sing lyric poetry on demand, to tell well-crafted stories, to engage in philosophical debate, and to participate in drinking games like kotobos, in which players flicked the dregs of their wine cups at a target. The symposium was simultaneously a social performance, a philosophical seminar, an artistic event, and a drinking competition. The greatest works of Greek lyric poetry by Sappho, Alcaeus, Pindar were written to be performed at occasions like this. Plato's dialogue, The Symposium, where Socrates, Aristophanes, and others take turns giving speeches about the nature of love, is set at exactly such an occasion. It captures both the intellectual brilliance and the slightly competitive, slightly chaotic atmosphere of a real symposium, people showing off, ideas genuinely colliding, drink gradually loosening the tongue, and one gate-crashing drunk, Alcibiades in this case, disrupting the carefully managed proceedings. It reads like the transcript of a party that got out of hand in the best possible way. Chapter 8. War, Death, and the Greek Way of Endings. The Phalanx, Democracy in Military Form. The Greek way of war was, like so much in Greek culture, a collective enterprise. The dominant military formation of the classical period was the hoplite phalanx, a tight formation of heavily armed infantrymen, each carrying a large round shield, the hoplon, from which the word hoplite comes, a long spear, and a short sword. The key feature of the phalanx was its interdependence. Your shield protected not just yourself, but also the man to your left, whose shield in turn protected you. The formation only worked if everyone held the line. Breaking and running didn't just endanger you, it killed the men beside you. This military system had profound social implications. Hoplites equipped themselves at their own expense, which meant that fighting in the phalanx was originally a middle-class activity. You had to be prosperous enough to afford the armor. As hoplite warfare became the dominant military form, the middle-class citizens who did the fighting gained political leverage. In Athens, the expansion of democratic rights tracked closely with the expansion of military participation. The men who fought for the city demanded, and eventually won, the right to govern it. Greek battles were typically short, violent, and decisive. Two phalanxes would approach each other, shields locked, spears leveled, and crash together in what ancient sources describe as a horrifying wall of noise and pressure. The pushing, shoving, stabbing chaos that followed, called the othismos, or the shove, would last minutes rather than hours before one side broke and fled. Pursuit was often half-hearted. Once the enemy broke, the battle was typically considered over, and the victors set about stripping the dead of their armor. Casualty rates, though brutal, were often lower than in modern warfare, partly because engagements were so short, partly because defeated soldiers were often allowed to flee. Death, burial, and what comes next. For the Greeks, proper burial was not just a social nicety, it was a religious obligation with profound consequences. The soul of an unburied person, the psyche, was believed to wander the banks of the river Styx for 100 years, unable to cross into the underworld, condemned to a limbo of restless suffering. This belief explains why Greek tragedies are full of anguished debates about whether a fallen enemy deserves burial. Denying burial was the ultimate act of posthumous vengeance, and refusing it to a fallen warrior was a serious moral transgression. The Greek underworld Hades was a gray, joyless place rather than a place of active punishment. Most souls went to the asphodel meadows, where they wandered in a kind of colorless, purposeless existence, stripped of memory and personality. The truly heroic or divinely favored went to the Elysian fields, a paradise of eternal happiness. The very worst offenders, Sisyphus, Tantalus, Ixion, were subjected to creative eternal torments in Tartarus. But most people spent eternity in the dull middle, remembered by no one, doing nothing, going nowhere. Greek funeral rituals were elaborate and strictly observed. The body was washed, anointed with oil, and dressed in fine clothing. A coin was placed in the mouth or on the eyes to pay Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the Styx. Without it, you couldn't cross. The body was then displayed at home for a day, mourned by family and professional mourners, women hired to weep and wail, before being carried in procession to the burial site. Graves were marked with stone markers called stelae, often beautifully carved with images of the deceased and inscriptions that seem achingly human across 2.5 millennia. Stranger, I was young and died. Do not pity me. Pity those I left behind. Final thoughts. Why ancient Greece still lives in you. Here's the thing about ancient Greece that nobody quite prepares you for. The more you learn about it, the harder it is to think of it as ancient. The problems the Greeks wrestled with are our problems. How do you build a society that is just? How do you balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? What is the good life, and how do you live it? What do we owe to people who are different from us? How do you face death with dignity? These questions don't have answers that expire. The Greeks didn't solve them, but they asked them with a clarity and a courage that still resonates. The dark parts of Greek life are also our inheritance. The casual acceptance of slavery, the exclusion of women from public life, the brutality of the Spartan system, the contempt for manual labor, These aren't ancient aberrations safely confined to the past. They are early expressions of tendencies that every society has had to consciously choose to reject, and that many still haven't fully rejected. The Greeks force us to hold two truths at once: that a society can produce extraordinary beauty, intellectual brilliance, and genuine wisdom, while simultaneously being built on foundations of profound injustice. But what strikes me most when I imagine a day in ancient Athens is how recognizably human it all is. A man stopping at the agora to catch up on gossip. A woman managing a complicated household while navigating the walls society had built around her. A teenager dreading his philosophy lesson. A farmer watching the sky and worrying about rain. A soldier coming home and not knowing how to talk about what he'd seen. A philosopher sitting in the sun, unable to stop asking questions nobody wanted to answer. These people invented democracy, theater, philosophy, history as a discipline, and the Olympic Games. They built temples that still define our idea of architectural beauty. They asked questions that 2,500 years of human thought still hasn't fully answered, and they did all of it while living in small, dark houses, eating barley bread for breakfast, worrying about their kids, and arguing with their neighbors. They were, in other words, us, just without the coffee.